The moment my father-in-law slid the manila folder across the dining table toward me, the room went deathly silent. It was a divorce demand, cold and calculated, wrapped in legal jargon. Before I reveal the contents of that folder and the truth that shattered their world, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I looked at the folder, but I didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, I surveyed the Sterling family dining room. The crystal chandelier cast a sharp, sterile light over the mahogany table, illuminating the faces of the people I had called family. For 5 years, I had been the silent investor in their curated version of reality. I was 29 years old, a project manager who had built her own financial independence from the ground up, navigating complex corporate structures every single day. Yet, in this house, I was perpetually the outsider. I was the commoner who had somehow infiltrated their elite ranks. They demanded absolute loyalty, but treated my presence as a premium subscription service where I was constantly footing the bill. Whenever there was a lavish vacation to the Hamptons, a sudden shortfall for one of their luxury car leases, or a country club fee that needed immediate settling, the invoice somehow always found its way to me. I subsidized their vanity while they reminded me, in 1,000 subtle, degrading ways, that I did not possess their pedigree. People on the outside often ask why someone stays in a situation so clearly detrimental to their own balance sheet. They see the financial drain and they mistake endurance for weakness. But staying was not a symptom of fragility. It was the invisible chain of the survivor. When you are constantly subjected to subtle emotional attrition, you develop a form of learned helplessness, a psychological adaptation where survival looks like compliance. I hadn't been weak. I had been managing an ongoing crisis, trapped in a prison that did not have iron bars, but rather the heavy, suffocating expectations of familial duty. Every time I handed over my credit card, I was purchasing temporary peace. It was an operational cost I accepted to keep the merger alive. I subsidized their lifestyle because I mistakenly believed that eventual inclusion would be the return on my investment. But there was no return. I was nothing more than an open line of credit to people who viewed my bank account as their birthright. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown, it was an audit. The manila folder sitting in front of me was the final financial disclosure. It proved what the numbers had been whispering for months. They did not want me. They only wanted the assets I provided. And now, believing they had extracted all the value they could, they were initiating the liquidation phase. I didn't cry. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. Sterling, the patriarch, cleared his throat. He sat at the head of the table, projecting an air of absolute authority that his actual bank accounts had not supported in over a decade. Next to him sat Beverly, her face arranged in an expression of practiced, aristocratic pity. They informed me, in perfectly measured, transactional tones, that they expected me to leave the marriage completely empty-handed. They demanded I sign away any claim to the shared assets, framing it not as a theft, but as the only honourable exit for someone of my background. They spun a narrative where I was the liability, and this divorce was a generous severance package. I shifted my gaze to Grant, my husband of 5 years. He sat beside his mother, staring intently at his water glass. He absolutely refused to meet my eyes, demonstrating an utter lack of character. He was defaulting on our contract, hiding behind his parents' legal manoeuvring, while letting them do the dirty work. To the rational mind, their audacity was staggering. But looking at them across the polished mahogany, I understood the exact psychological mechanism at play. It was the trap of cruel normalization. Over time, families built on entitlement and false prestige convince themselves that their cruelty is merely the necessary defense of their legacy. They had normalized their toxic behavior to such an extent that bleeding an outsider dry felt completely justified and appropriate. They did not see their actions as theft, extortion, or abuse. They saw it as collecting their rightful due from someone privileged enough to be associated with the Sterling name. Their cruelty was not a sudden malfunction of morality. It was their standard operating procedure. By viewing me strictly as a resource rather than a human being, they effectively bypassed their own cognitive dissonance. They weren't shocked by what they were doing. They were fully convinced of their own righteousness. I placed my hands flat on the table. There was no need to negotiate with bad faith actors. I did not ask why. I did not plead for the return on my emotional investment. I simply stood up, leaving the manila folder untouched on the table. The silence in the room stretched, thick with their anticipation of a breakdown that would never arrive. I walked out of the dining room, leaving their house and their toxic corporate culture behind. The time for emoting was over. The time for strategizing had begun. The Sterlings thought they had just fired me. They didn't realize they had just breached a contract with someone who kept immaculate receipt. I walked out of the front door into the cool evening air. I didn't speed away or slam the car door in a fit of panic. I sat in the driver's seat, pulled out my phone and dialed a number. Sophie picked up on the second ring. She was 29, an attorney whose mind operated like a steel trap. She was my anchor, the grounded legal voice of reason who never let emotion cloud a winning strategy. "I just left the house," I told her, my voice perfectly level. "They presented the folder. They want me out with nothing." Sophie didn't offer empty sympathies or ask how I was feeling. She knew this was a business transaction now. "Meet me at the office in 20 minutes, she replied. "Bring your laptop and your security tokens." By midnight, we were sitting in the fluorescent glow of her firm's conference room. The retaliation process had officially begun. We initiated a covert audit of the $1,500,000 investment fund that Grant and I jointly managed. For months, I had noticed minor discrepancies, small, uncharacteristic withdrawals that Grant had waved off as administrative overhead and market fluctuations. But tonight, I wasn't accepting his executive summaries. I was looking at the raw data. Luckily, because I had been the silent investor managing their corporate structures for 5 years, I had direct administrative access to the primary ledger backups stored on the secure cloud server. Sophie and I traced the digital paper trail, cross-referencing ledger entries with bank statements. The numbers told a story that Grant's mouth never could. It wasn't a matter of poor market performance or bad investments. It was systematic, methodical theft. Funds were being diverted into shell limited liability companies, entities registered under names that traced back to Sterling's private holding company. They had been draining the joint account, quietly siphoning off my capital to artificially inflate the Sterling family's failing real estate portfolio. I watched the spreadsheet populate, every row a confirmed breach of trust. I didn't feel betrayal. I felt the cold satisfaction of proving a hypothesis. The Sterlings had vastly underestimated my accounting skills. They assumed I would be too blinded by grief or intimidation to check the ledgers. They thought they had secured a clean getaway. Instead, they had thoroughly documented their own embezzlement. "We have them," Sophie stated quietly, highlighting a sequence of illicit transfers on her monitor. "This isn't just grounds for a favourable divorce settlement. This is corporate fraud." I leaned back in the leather chair, looking at the glowing numbers. The initial anger had completely evaporated, replaced by a crystalline focus. We were going to dismantle them, not with yelling or tears, but with forensic accounting. As we dug deeper into the financial records, the true magnitude of the deception surfaced. Sophie cross-referenced a series of unusual wire transfers that didn't align with the family's real estate front. She isolated a specific offshore account that had been receiving large, regular deposits. That was when she uncovered the kill shot. "Look at this," Sophie said, her finger tracing a line on the monitor. "These funds aren't going to Sterling's corporate holdings. These are going directly to offshore gaming syndicates." The puzzle pieces snapped together with lethal precision. Grant hadn't just been quietly funneling money to support his parents' fading empire. He had engaged in a much deeper, more personal betrayal. Earlier that year, Grant had informed me he had undergone a vasectomy, claiming it was a mutual decision for our lifestyle and future planning. But the timeline of these massive medical expenses aligned perfectly with the first massive withdrawal from my personal trust fund. He hadn't paid for a medical procedure at all. Grant didn't just have a vasectomy. He used my personal trust fund as a piggy bank to cover his older brother's catastrophic gambling debts. The sheer audacity of the lie was structural. He had weaponized our private medical decisions to obscure the fact that he was financing his family's vices with my capital. He forged your digital signature on the trust authorization forms, Sophie confirmed, pulling up the portable document format files side by side with the bank records. He transferred $250,000 in a single quarter. This was the criminal twist. They weren't just terrible in-laws and a negligent husband, they were active felons. The moral bankruptcy was absolute and total. They had stolen my future to pay for their present, using the most intimate aspects of our marriage as a smokescreen for grand larceny. Print it all, I instructed, my voice calm. Compile the evidence binder. Draft the fraud charges. We worked until dawn, assembling a bulletproof dossier. Every forged signature, every illegal wire transfer, every piece of fabricated correspondence was categorized and indexed. This was no longer a divorce proceeding. It was an execution of judgment. We had weaponized their own greed against them. The documents for fraud were ready, the evidence was incontrovertible, and the trap was perfectly set. At 9 o'clock the next morning, Sophie and I walked into the Sterling family corporate office. As a primary shareholder, with my own personal capital, tied to their real estate portfolio, I utilized my legal right to inspect the company's books, a clause they had foolishly overlooked in our original investment agreement. The receptionist tried to stop us, her eyes wide with panic. I didn't storm in. I walked in with the calm authority of a shareholder exercising my legal right, leaving the receptionist no choice but to let me pass. I pushed open the heavy double doors to Sterling's executive suite. Sterling was sitting behind his massive oak desk, reviewing quarterly reports. Grant and Beverly were seated on the leather sofas, looking over brochures for a vacation home, the ultimate display of their misplaced confidence. The moment they saw me, their relaxed posture vanished, replaced by defensive tension. "What is the meaning of this?" Sterling demanded, standing up. He puffed out his chest, attempting to intimidate me one last time with his patriarch routine. "I told you to direct all communication to our attorneys. You have no business being here." "I am her attorney," Sophie said smoothly. She stepped forward and dropped a thick brown envelope directly onto his mahogany desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "This is not a negotiation," I said, my voice as cold and hard as concrete. "This is your eviction notice from my life." Sterling ripped open the envelope, his face twisting into a sneer that quickly froze. As he read the cover letter summarizing the fraud charges, the color rapidly drained from his face. The aggressive patriarch was suddenly replaced by a panicked old man staring at his own ruin. Beverly leaned over to look at the documents. She let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as she read the exact dollar amounts. I turned my attention to Grant. He was staring at the stack of bank statements showing the gambling debt payoffs and the forged trust fund transfers. His eyes were wide, darting from the papers to me. "You forged my signature to pay your brother's bookies," I stated, the words slicing through the silence. "I've already filed a formal complaint with the Financial Crimes Unit. With this mountain of documented forensic evidence, their indictment is inevitable, and it's only a matter of time before the feds knock on your door." "Elise, please," Grant stammered, the arrogance totally wiped from his features. "We can fix this. Don't do this." "I didn't do anything," I replied, feeling the absolute power reversal. "I just audited your work." They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. Grant realized in that exact moment that his career in finance was effectively dead. He would face federal charges. Sterling's company would be audited and dismantled. They had lost everything, not because I was vengeful, but because they were massive liabilities. Sophie and I turned and walked out, leaving them to suffocate in the wreckage of their own deceit. I didn't wait for their excuses or their lawyers' frantic calls. I knew the evidence would do the talking, and I didn't owe them another second of my time. The aftermath was swift and merciless. The Sterlings were left to face the full, devastating legal consequences of their fraud. Grant's financial licenses were permanently revoked pending his criminal trial. Sterling's firm, built on decades of projected superiority, was seized by creditors and federal investigators before the week was out. Beverly's country club memberships were cancelled as their assets were frozen. Their collapse was spectacular, and it perfectly illustrated the power illusion of the empty wallet. They had always operated under the delusion that their worth was inherent, failing to realize the vast difference between having material wealth and actually being a person of value. Their entire position in society was merely a fragile facade, rented with stolen money. The moment that capital was stripped away, they had absolutely no internal character to keep them standing. Stripped of their stolen funds, they were reduced to nothing more than ordinary criminals facing extraordinary prison sentences. I walked out of that building and into the bright morning sunlight. The air felt different. It was the atmosphere of an uncertain but entirely independent future. I hadn't just reclaimed my stolen funds, I had reclaimed my autonomy and my self-respect. I did not look back at the corporate suite, and I did not answer any of Grant's frantic, grovelling voicemails. The balance sheet was finally clear. I've come to realize that silence isn't weakness. It is the most powerful tool for uncovering the truth. When you stop talking and start observing, people will always show you exactly who they are. I used to think that maintaining a family required endless compromise, but I learned that true wealth is being able to walk away from people who demand you diminish your existence for their comfort. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free by forgiving yourself for trusting them and moving forward without them dragging you down. If you've ever had to set a hard boundary with people who didn't respect you, tell your story in the comments. Let's support each other in the truth. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice.